This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. In late June, the Supreme Court issued several landmark rulings regarding immigration, including birthright citizenship, asylum, and temporary protective status, or TPS. The court ended protective status for Haitian and Syrian immigrants and upheld policy of turning away asylum seekers at the U.S.-Mexico border. The court also chose to uphold birthright citizenship, something that's guaranteed in the 14th Amendment. Chief Justice John Roberts ruled that people born in the U.S. are American citizens. Today, we hear how these rulings will affect immigrants everywhere, including those working and living in Connecticut. Joining us now is Jimena Bustillo, an NPR reporter who covers the Department of Homeland Security and immigration policy at the network's national desk in Washington, D.C. Jimena, welcome back to Where We Live.
Hi, Catherine.
So I just threw out a lot of information for our listeners. Can you put what we just mentioned into some context? What we saw at the Supreme Court in June?
Yeah, there were three decisions that we were really watching in terms of how immigration policy was going to continue to be shaped under this administration. Just a little bit of context here is this administration really kicked off its term with a few landmark executive orders and has since taken additional steps to limit the ways people can legally be in the country, can enter the country, or stay once they're already here. And so the three cases that we were looking at was one related to temporary protected status, or TPS, particularly, as you mentioned, to Haitians and Syrians, but the results of that case have broader implications. A second one was on an asylum policy called metering, which essentially would allow the Border Patrol officials and agents to turn away people at the border before they can physically enter the country to claim asylum. And then the third was whether or not babies born on U.S. soil would be automatically granted birthright citizenship. And so the results were a little bit mixed. So the administration won on two of those, on the terminations of TPS and on the asylum policy, and lost on birthright citizenship.
So I want to go deep on all of the points you just made, really, but I want to start with birthright citizenship. So it's something that's been widely observed since the end of the Civil War, and the Supreme Court ruling is a setback for President Trump, who had issued an executive order, as you mentioned, declaring that children born to people in the U.S. illegally are not American citizens. So can you walk us through the implications of this ruling?
Right. I mean, the implications of this ruling means that things pretty much stay the same. So it, doesn't seem significant. But if the results had gone in Trump's favor, it would have completely upended the way that we understand the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It would have potentially really shifted the lives of hundreds of thousands of children that have been born since the administration began, which is when the executive order would have, kind of began this policy of not counting babies born here as automatic citizens. It really would have just created a lot of logistical challenges, both for individual families, but also federal agencies that then have to kind of decide how they're going to issue paperwork, hospitals that are going to need to decide how to issue paperwork as well when someone is born in the United States. Currently the only exception for birthright citizenship is the children of diplomats. But for the most part, regardless of your parents' legal status or temporary status to be in the United States, you are automatically a citizen when you're born here. And I think that was really shown in the individual plaintiffs that were a part of this case. One was someone that was an asylum seeker and had a child and then later received a green card. And it's like, in theory, if this had gone in Trump's favor, even that child's citizenship would have been brought into question. Others were, trying to seek asylum and had given birth while in that process. And then another one was actually a U.S. citizen whose spouse is an undocumented immigrant. And so you really saw the range of people people that would be affected. And it really went beyond people who are here without authorization.
Well, it sounds like the implications are typically a lot further than one expects. It's not so simple as you may imagine. And another complication here is when the court ended temporary protective status, or TPS, as we've been talking about for Haitians and Syrian immigrants. Can you help us understand what exactly does the TPS entail and how ending this program will impact these communities?
Right. So temporary protected status is a program that was created by Congress around 1990, and it essentially provides a protection from deportation and a work permit to people who are from specific countries that the DHS secretary has decided that are too dangerous for people to return to, either because they were already here and are not able to go back, or they were here without legal status and it cannot be removed. And some of those reasons can include war, natural disasters, political instability, any other reason that individual DHS secretary might decide. Now, temporary protected status is granted basically to countries, like it's a country designation. It's not like asylum where an individual can kind of claim this protection. And it's designated to each country 6 to 18 months, and it can be renewed. And typically we have seen that. So one example is El Salvador, which still has its TPS designation until later this year. But they have had TPS since, specifically TPS since about 2001. And so that has been renewed and renewed and renewed across administrations, across leaderships. And we've seen that for several other countries. TPS has been canceled by several presidents of different political parties for different countries. But what we saw this administration do that was very different is basically every time a country's expiration date came up last year, it was an automatic cancellation. And so we saw the termination of TPS for about 10 countries last year, including Haiti and Syria, and that was estimated to have affected about 1 million people. Now, the implications of this ruling, yes, they are specific to Haiti and Syria, but a lot of folks have told me that it goes much broader than that. Basically, the Supreme Court had issued a ruling saying that they have no business in deciding whether or not the DHS secretary made a correct decision or looked at correct factors when deciding whether to extend or remove a TPS, which basically means the administration can continue moving forward with all of these terminations.
Well, you mentioned the broader implications, and I would love for you to sort of take us more into that because as we are learning, the TPS ruling could present a lot of sudden roadblocks and challenges for many of these communities. How are the immigrant communities responding to this? What are you hearing from them?
There's a lot of confusion, and I think, the word of the year really is limbo in terms of how people are affected. So technically, Syrians and Haitians did not automatically lose their work permits, for example. And in this population, we are talking about over 250,000 people, so a sizable amount. They didn't automatically lose their work status, but, any day now they could. Essentially, we're waiting for the federal courts to essentially issue the final decision. One of those, the courts ping pong the directives. So the Supreme Court sent it back to the lower court. Lower court needs to issue that decision. Last week, DHS did issue a notice saying that work permits would expire essentially on July 10th. So that gives us about 3 more dates. But people are really, I think, dealing with the immediate decisions of, how long do I have my job? Employers are trying to decide how long they have their employees. I have seen a lot of labor attorney bulletins come through my inbox of, warnings to not automatically just fire your employees just yet. And, I think everyone is still trying to figure out how to best move forward.
And in addition to ending TPS, the court also upheld a federal law that prevents asylum seekers from entering the country and applying for asylum. So you mentioned earlier there is a distinction between asylum and the temporary protective status. So can you explain how this might affect people seeking asylum in the future?
Yeah, so this decision probably had the least immediate consequences out of the three. So it's important to remember that the Trump administration has already made it virtually impossible to seek asylum at the southern border. There already under the Biden administration had been limits on where you could seek asylum. So you could only go to a designated port of entry, and then you could only request an appointment by using an app formerly known as CBP-1. And as soon as Trump came into office, he shut down that app pretty much immediately, which was the only way people were able to seek asylum if they were not already in the country. And that process has not restarted. And so, just to clarify, it was already very, very difficult to show up to a port of entry, claim asylum. However, this Supreme Court decision was basically a reignited lawsuit from the Trump administration on a policy that is technically not in effect. So. The way that it would work is, if someone comes to a port of entry, the Border Patrol agent would be able to turn them away before that person physically crosses from, let's say, Mexican land to US land. So we're talking very, very physical elements here. And if you are standing on the Mexico side and are turned away before you can enter, you cannot claim asylum. And that is a policy that is technically not in place right now because there isn't a way to do that. However, it really goes to show how the administration is further limiting the idea of asylum and the ability to claim asylum at all in the United States. Once you're already in the United States, you can basically only claim asylum within about a year, I believe it is, of being in the country. And so already, if you think about about a year ago, the border crossings were really limited. Everything really stopped. There was kind of only a set number of people that could claim asylum once already here in the country. So this just really goes to the idea of furthering how you can come into the country and how you can argue for an ability to stay.
Well, and there's so much navigating through all of these different systems and programs. And on top of that, there have been reports that arrests of immigrants have surged in recent days. Is that because of the Supreme Court rulings, or what have you been seeing over the last couple of weeks?
Not necessarily. I mean, we have seen DHS for over a year increase their capacity in terms of their resources to be able to go out and make more arrests, have more people in detention, and more deportations. They have said that they've kept a pretty steady arrest count of about 1,200 people a day. And in recent weeks, we've seen reports of that surging to even 3,000 people a day. That's not necessarily tied to these rulings. So it's not connected to the asylum ruling. It's not connected to the birthright ruling. We're not sure if it could be connected to the TPS ruling, though a lot of attorneys have told me that essentially if they have clients that had final orders for removal, then they could be subject to an immediate enforcement action themselves. But I think it's also important to remember that DHS has gotten a lot of money very recently from Congress. So Congress most recently approved $70 billion to the agency specifically to do this kind of work. And they did hire like 12,000 more immigration and customs enforcement officers by the end of last year. And it's, not like those people aren't going to be sitting around just not doing their jobs. They have all these resources, they have all this money, and now they have the personnel. So they're going to continue to keep the steady drumbeat of increased arrests and deportations.
Well, you've been reporting on the on the Trump administration's greater strategies to change the U.S. immigration system pretty much since the beginning of it. What are some of the strategies that you've learned so far?
Right. It really is an olive government approach, which I think we always hear from every administration about whatever their top priority is. But I do think it is important to remember that pretty much every federal law enforcement agency has been tasked with prioritizing immigration arrests, whether it's ATF, FBI, at one point even Postal and Park Police as well. And so you are seeing that be front of mind for a lot of federal agencies. But we have also seen this administration administration tap into a lot of its own executive powers. I have been very closely tracking a lot of the changes to immigration courts and the immigration court system, and how the administration is utilizing that court calendar to both speed up and delay the hearings of people waiting for a chance to argue why they should get to stay before an immigration judge. Both of those things lead to a greater chance that someone might be removed or be issued a final order for deportation, either because they are waiting for several more years before they get that chance, therefore making them vulnerable, or if their case gets suddenly pushed up and they have no idea and don't show up to their hearings. But we're also seeing the other side of that coin as well. Immigration court is where people often without legal status argue why they should stay, but the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service is where people do the quote unquote right path and apply for further ability to stay and legally work in the United States, whether that's visas and work permits, green cards, and citizenship. And we're seeing that side of the immigration system be really slowed down, more scrutiny, a lot of pauses, a lot of delays on people being able to renew their statuses, which has resulted in people having a lapse in their status and becoming deportable, essentially, when normally they would have never been.
Well, you've been reporting extensively on this, of course, and the last time we've chatted, we were discussing about all of the executive orders that were coming down. Since then, was there anything that surprised you?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not sure that anything has necessarily surprised me, just in terms of we knew that this administration was going to really prioritize this policy. And so it really was a question of, how far do they go? How many systems do they know how to use this time around to really, pursue their goals? And I think that it should not be surprising that they are using nearly every tool in the toolbox to be able to limit migration, to be able to increase removals and deportations. And then over the past year, I would say literally about a year since Congress approved the first $70 billion that made ICE the highest paid, highest funded federal law enforcement agency, they just simply have money to do all the work that they want to do. And I think that funding piece is really critically important. Without money and without those resources, there is a limit to what you can do. And past administrations have ran into that problem, but this administration has really been able to utilize the power of the purse in Congress to be able to fund their initiatives.
And as you're following this and everything is changing so fluidly, I think daily, is there something specific that you're looking for next?
Yeah, I think my eye continues to be on how a lot of these systems are further impacting the legal paths to migration within the country. I think that over time we have seen a lot of people without legal status obviously be the target of a lot of enforcement initiatives from Democratic administrations, from Republican administrations. But I think the changes to these legal paths and what it takes for someone to reach that, I think is newer under this administration. And so I'll be really tracking that in the next few months.
Jimena Bustillo, DHS and immigration policy reporter at NPR. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Coming up, local immigrant advocates from Connecticut respond to recent Supreme Court decisions. This is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. It's been a big year for immigration at the Supreme Court. Today, we hear how these rulings will affect immigrants living in Connecticut. Joining us now is Tabitha Sugdeo, who's the executive director of Connecticut Students for a Dream. Tabitha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
We also have Wayne Unger, who's the associate professor of law at Quinnipiac University School of Law. Wayne, appreciate you coming on as well.
A pleasure to be here.
And also Maggie Mitchell-Salem, who's the executive director at the Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services in New Haven. Maggie, welcome back.
Thank you.
So Maggie, you were listening to the conversation we just had with NPR's Jimena Bustillo. on what we just saw at the Supreme Court in recent weeks, and she shared a lot of information with us. Was there anything that jumped out to you?
It just reinforced an analogy that our head of immigration legal services has been making for months, which is that in the first Trump term, it was like turning off the water. And in this term, it's ripping out the plumbing. And that is having a widespread impact across the entire immigration system and impacting thousands of people in the state of Connecticut. And if you look more widely at the both direct familial impacts and indirectly community impacts, it's hard to think of a place that isn't affected, from employers to families to schools. It's horrible.
So upholding birthright citizenship was considered sort of a positive, not necessarily a win for immigrant communities, but certainly challenges ahead. And many people are being optimistic, cautiously optimistic about it. What are your thoughts on that?
I saw it as a loss. Anything short of a very clear majority. You know, you could hope for 9-0, and in this court, that's almost impossible. But to come down to a 5-4 victory, and especially, I look at what the other side is saying about, you know, what some would call a loss for them, and they're seeing this as an opportunity that they were within one vote. And that, to me, is so dangerous and distressing.
Were you surprised to see how close the vote was?
I was hoping, I think some part of the ruling was 6-3. I was hoping that it was going to be closer to a 6-3 overall. And so this was just far too close for comfort. I know I don't want to suggest that we should not be breathing a sigh of relief about this 5-4 victory, but we should also, once we've rested from this fight, be ready for what's coming next, because there will be another attempt.
And Wayne, curious to hear your thoughts here in terms of what Maggie just shared.
Yeah, so Maggie shared there was essentially two ways to count this case. There's the 6-3 and then the 5-4. And so I want to clarify that first. The 5-4 decision is based on the constitutional question, which is whether the 14th Amendment, Section 1, actually provides that birthright citizenship. And that's what the court decided on a 5-4 vote, with Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett siding with the liberals on that constitutional question. Now, on the 6-3, 6 justices agreed on the outcome of the case, meaning overturning Trump's executive order that he signed at the beginning of the term. Justice Kavanaugh is the justice that kind of is in question here. And what I mean by that is Justice Kavanaugh said, I agree with the outcome in that the executive order is unlawful. However, I disagree on the constitutional question. So in his eyes, it wasn't a constitutional question. It was more so a statutory question where immigration statutory law did not permit or was silent on this question. That means 3 justices, Justice Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, disagreed with the entire court and said that the executive order, in their eyes, was lawful.
Well, appreciate the distinction, because Tabitha, I was going to ask you, because it can be hard to keep up with all the court rulings and all of the nuances and the contexts of these decisions coming out, you know, as well as the overall changes to the immigration system. What are you hearing from people you work with? Is there a lot of confusion? Is there a lot of fear? You know, what are you seeing?
Sure. You know, I have to say too, I'm a law student, so it is challenging to continuously have to read these decisions and to see the ways in which immigrants are being described. I think for the average immigrant, the details of the cases are not necessarily observed closely, right? And so with the birthright citizenship case, I think what comes to mind is that, okay, everything for the most part remains the same. And thinking about, you know, TPS, I know we'll talk about that shortly. If parents have lost their status and their child is born here and they have status by way of birthright citizenship, that doesn't necessarily make things easier for them in having to navigate their reality now here in the state of Connecticut.
And can you talk more about how does that look like for the communities? Because I know we're specifically talking about the Haitian communities or the Syrian communities, but of course we know it's beyond them.
Sure. There's a lot of fear. There's a ton of fear because people don't know what all of this means for them practically. And, there are folks who have had TPS, especially Haitians, from since 2010 during the earthquakes that occurred. And folks have been here for at least a decade and have purchased homes. They have jobs. They're well established. They've had children here. And so people are not going to, we're seeing them not going to the hospital. We're seeing them not going to the grocery store. And I think especially for the Haitian community, it's been particularly challenging because they're not sufficient language resources, for instance, here in the state. And, there was a claim around racial animus towards Black immigrants, right? That was one of the claims there in the Supreme Court decision. And the reality is that there are not enough resources, point blank, for Black immigrants here in the state of Connecticut. And in seeing the fallout of what's to come, it's extremely evident.
Well, we have Connecticut public reporter Eddie Martinez, who recently spoke to a Norwalk resident, Guy Buseco. He's a Haitian American, and here's what Guy shared with us.
A lot of these people are members of our communities, members of our church. So it is very disappointing. A few years ago, we were accused of eating pets. And every time this administration has a chance to demonize or villainize Haitian, they don't miss that chance to do it. So why they do it, I cannot say. We cannot just say, could this have been me? Is will that be me in the next few years? Because again, nothing is guaranteed.
Well, Tabitha, you've been nodding, listening to what Guy shared. Are you hearing similar sentiments?
Absolutely. What comes to mind too, last administration were the images of federal officers on horses with whips as there were Haitian asylum seekers coming across, to seek asylum. And it just brings a picture to me about just the racialization of the situation. And as we talk to Haitian immigrants and what options are, the reality is that with the massive delegalization of statuses, there are not many places to go. One can try to apply for asylum, but it's already been over a decade, right? One can try to see what other options are available, but the reality is that there aren't very many. And so people have to make extremely difficult decisions at this point. And now looking at this, coupled with other issues that Black immigrants have to face around, over-policing, around the fact that they're treated a lot differently, even within detention centers, it really breaks my heart. And it's tough to have to look at a family, look them in the eyes, and to be extremely honest and to say, there are not very many options for you. And I don't mean to create fear. This is the reality for many people.
Well, and Maggie, as what Tabitha just shared and what we just heard from Guy, it is a very real reality for many of our communities here in Connecticut and beyond just the bureaucracy and the paperwork that they have to go through to be a part of their communities. So what are you hearing from immigrants here in the state? What's your experience been like?
Well, I mean, I would just say overall, and to absolutely reinforce what Tabitha said, what you are seeing play out, it's from Jimenez reporting as well, is essentially a white Christian nationalist immigration policy. I'm just going to say it bluntly. And I think Justice Kagan, in deliberately citing evidence of the administration's racial animus in her dissent for the TPS ruling, was to make clear there was a racial bias. And I think we need to say what it is and say it up front, because the administration's saying it. I feel like those of us who live this work every day are, and I'm in no way saying this about Tabitha. Tabitha is an amazing champion for the community. But I think we need to be more forward in looking at the totality of what's happening. And so you're asking me about what we're seeing from those that we serve. So we're serving a wide range of individuals, both formally and informally, because people are just asking us questions. Folks who are here who are trying to figure out a work visa, right? They're here legally, but now they're trying to determine when they're coming off of their student visa and their OPT or professional training, how can they adjust to another kind of visa in order to remain? And every pathway has been impacted, either in price, in the delays that Jimena mentioned at the beginning at USCIS, which is processing things a lot slower, very deliberately. And so what we hear from refugees and humanitarian parolees and folks that have filed for asylum or considering filing for asylum, and from Haitians, there just aren't, like Tabitha said, we're having to tell people you don't have great options. Let us help you think through what this looks like for your family. And, our food pantry is seeing a surge in interest and the volume of families coming to the food pantry or seeking help from a volunteer to go get the food so that they don't have to show up because they're worried about an ICE action. The kids not going to school, that's been well documented at the end of last school year. Mm-hmm. Across our entire society, these policies, which in their totality are racist against brown, Black, and largely Muslim communities, among others. But also you see Asian Americans feeling afraid. They may be here with some kind of status, but feeling villainized. Because if you are other, as this administration tries to depict an America that may have existed in the 1950s, and we certainly don't want to go back to that time, and where you had a seemingly dominant culture and others repressed or suppressed, often violently. That's not where we see our country and not where the country has moved in the past 75 years. And so, sorry to be so blunt and stark about it, but if you are one of those communities, you are going to be feeling this in very real ways.
Well, I want to ask Wayne here, building on exactly what Maggie just shared, especially with the totality and the hard questions that are being asked of you and the hard answers that you're perhaps giving them. What are conversations like for you, Wayne?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, in my role as a constitutional law professor and scholar, I try to take a step back and say, here's the totality from a legal perspective or from a constitutional perspective, because this one decision, so let's take birthright citizenship as an example, Trump v. Barbara is the case name. If the court had overturned the 128-year-old, I think it's 128-year-old precedent, United States versus Wong Kim Ark, which doesn't quite roll off my tongue very well, so I'm just going to refer to that case as Wong. If the court overturned that and said, we agree with the Trump administration on the executive order, the implications of that would be widespread, not just from a practical perspective, not just, of course, affecting lives of people across the country, but also people across the world. It would have fundamentally changed America for years to come. And so let me give you an example. The Trump administration is actively pushing for this bill in Congress called the Save America Act. And the Save America Act is essentially a national voter ID law, which would likely be held constitutional based on other precedents at the Supreme Court level. And you would be required to show proof of citizenship when registering to vote. Now, today, under Wong Kim Ark in this current conception of birthright citizenship, that means your birth certificate is what we say in the law dispositive evidence of your citizenship. If you show your birth certificate because of birthright citizenship, we know you are a citizen. Of course, assuming that the birth certificate is of course authentic and valid. Now, in a world in which, let's say hypothetically, the Supreme Court agreed with the Trump administration on its definition of birthright citizenship and upheld or affirmed the executive order, well, then in 18 years, that birth certificate is no longer dispositive evidence of citizenship, which means the only legal document that you could show when registering to vote as let's say, a brand new 18-year-old who has the constitutional right to vote, well, the only document really is your passport or a passport card, which requires money to get. And of course, the number of Americans who have a passport is certainly not as high as the number of Americans who have a birth certificate. So let me just wrap this as saying this would have really caused a burden onto many Americans because they would have to go get a passport or a passport card to prove their citizenship. And the last time I checked, I think it's $130 or $160 to get that passport. And so one of the arguments that I have made is essentially that acts as a poll tax, which the Constitution expressly prohibits, in saying that you have to pay this money in order to vote. And so those are the broad totality. That's the totality of the legal circumstance for some of the things that the Trump administration is doing.
Well, we have to go to a quick break. But before we do, Wayne, I do want to ask, as we're having this conversation today, do you expect we might see birthright citizenship challenged again in the future?
We will. So the Republicans in Congress, for example, and I'm on social media, so the Republicans in Congress are out there saying, okay, well, the Congress needs to act now. The thing here is, as I mentioned earlier, it was a 5-4 decision on the constitutional question, and that is binding, and no statute that Congress enacts can supersede the constitutional interpretation. So even if Congress passed a law, which Trump assumedly would sign into law, that defined birthright citizenship as something, like the Trump administration or the Republican Party generally wants, it wouldn't displace the decision Trump v. Barbara. So it's important to clarify that point. And in fact, I know congressmen and congresswomen and senators in the United States know that's the case, and yet they're still publicly representing that Congress can act, and which is just a political talking point, by the way. So it wouldn't happen. It would be challenged. Now, there are other things that the Republican Party can do, and I'll just say that, for example, we can push for a constitutional amendment and amend the Constitution to limit birthright citizenship, for example. But the federal Constitution is notoriously difficult to amend. And for example, it requires the vast majority of the states across the country to ratify any constitutional amendment. And I just don't see that happening in the current state of affairs. I don't see 3/4 of the states ratifying an amendment to limit birthright citizenship. So I think it is the kind of final decision at the moment, but that doesn't mean the Republican Party and Donald Trump in general will stop.
Our guests will stay with us for the rest of today's show. We're talking about the recent Supreme Court rulings on immigration with Connecticut Students for a Dream, Quinnipiac University School of Law, and the Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services in New Haven. We'll continue the conversation after a quick break. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about the Supreme Court and immigration. The court recently issued several landmark decisions that affect immigrant communities everywhere, including here in Connecticut. And I want to come back to Tabitha with the Connecticut Students for a Dream. Earlier, we heard about ICE presence and immigrant arrests ramping up across the country. What does that look like here in Connecticut?
Sure. So at Connecticut Students for a Dream, we hold an initiative that's called the Connecticut Immigrant Support Network. And through that initiative, we've helped to spin out a nonprofit law firm that's called TALC, or the American Immigrant Legal Clinic. And what we have been seeing through that work is a marked increase in detention activity across the state. And some of the numbers that we just wrapped up last month showed that we were honestly past the numbers from last year. And the numbers from last year were triple to quadruple from previous years before. So we're certainly seeing that. Some other patterns that we're seeing include multi-town ICE activity. In the past, we've only really seen, one town at a time being targeted, but we're seeing simultaneously 3 to 4 towns that are being affected, meaning that multiple people are being picked up, whether outside of courts, whether it's just in their cars. That's also something else that we're seeing. That's a shift in the state. We're seeing more traffic stops. And I think what comes with multi-town coordination includes increased number of officers. So we're also seeing that too. Last month, we saw something that was pretty disturbing in Danbury, where there were actually federal officers who showed up with film cameras. You all covered that piece too. So just disturbing trends across the board. And the reality is that as we work with rapid response groups on the ground, we are seeing that there are more people that are being picked up by federal officers than what community groups are able to track. So that's also been another trend that we've observed on the ground.
When talking about that level of data too, earlier there was mention about Asian Americans and Asian immigrants who are often overlooked in terms of this conversation. How are the Trump administration's policies affecting members of the AAPI community? Are we seeing the community being targeted here?
We don't have a terrible amount of racialized data that's been broken down, but we can say that there are certainly undocumented Asian community members that are here in the state, and certainly Asian undocumented immigrants who have been impacted by immigration enforcement here in the state of Connecticut. In last year, there were quite a bit of FOIA requests that were put out to the agencies to get data, and I know groups are still waiting for that data to come in so that we can actually parse through it. And so we've had to pivot in order to talk to groups individually and to talk to lawyers on the ground in order to pull together this data. Because unless we're doing this, we don't have a clear sense of what's happening on the ground. But we certainly see from the AAPI community, Filipino communities who are being affected here in the state, and also Chinese communities.
And Maggie, earlier we were talking about just the reality of a lot of our communities when it comes to accessing basic needs, accessing healthcare, including mental health care. What are barriers that you're seeing right now?
I think there are challenges for those that are seeking care, for those that, like our case managers, excuse me, and others on our staff and at the staff of other social service agencies, trying to get folks into care, and then from the service providers themselves, because the rules are changing for them too. I mean, when Jimenez said whole of government, I think of this in so many different ways, because the changes that are happening, we look at different spaces, right? We look at the benefits changes, and benefits changes like the reduction in access to SNAP, food assistance, and to Medicaid, which is coming for those that don't have green cards from the communities that we serve, refugees, humanitarian parolees, asylees, and others. And then what's happening in the healthcare space, where community agencies are under pressure to do more reporting of who they're serving and the immigration status of who they're serving. So that whole of government is also across other sectors outside of the narrow immigration lane, to have immigration really what your status is and who you are, that effort to seek data and use that against those that seek services. It has an impact. People don't seek services. That's the easiest way to say it.
Well, and pivoting a little bit, Wayne, over the weekend, celebrations were held across the country to mark America's 250th anniversary. As we're having this conversation today, does it strike you as a pretty significant moment to be considering issues of birthright citizenship sort of in conjunction with this anniversary?
So over the 250 years that our country has existed, or since the Declaration of Independence, I should say, there's a long history of both, say, the positive things about what America has brought to the world and what has happened in America, and then some not so positive things, kind of a darker history of the United States. And we have generally moved towards that more perfect union. And so there are many who argue that, and I'm sure my colleagues here on the call would agree, that there are many who argue that this is like one step back. And maybe we're going to take two steps forward, to be fair. The 250 years shows just the struggle over how we become a more perfect union. And, when I stand before my students teaching constitutional law, trying to teach it in an unbiased way, in a way that is open to different viewpoints, there are some viewpoints that are just candidly wrong. And for example, we as a society have moved away from, we fought a war over it, lots of Americans died over it. We have moved away from slavery. And we have said in the Constitution that slavery and involuntary servitude is unconstitutional. That's the 13th Amendment. And so we make these actions to strive towards a more perfect union. And that's what I think the 250 years demonstrates most strongly. So when we look at some of these efforts from the Trump administration in the immigration space, the birthright citizenship, as you mentioned, Kat, it feels, at least to me, that it's one step back. And I'm optimistic, though, that we will take those two steps forward as we continue to strive for that more perfect union. But I also recognize that there are always going to be competing visions of what America ought to look like and what the Constitution should look like, what the Constitution should protect. And as a constitutional law scholar, I still argue for that diversity in opinion, because if there's any founding principle of the United States, in my view, is that the United States has a right, we as Americans have a right to dissent. That is what America was founded on. We dissented from the monarchy and King George. We dissented from taxation without representation. We did not like anything about the crown. Well, to be fair, there were some who did. There were still loyalists to the crown during the American Revolution. But all that is to say, we have a tremendous amount of work to do, and we recognize that there are different viewpoints of that.
Well, this is certainly something that we will be continuing to keep our eyes on. I want to thank all of our guests today. You've been listening to Wayne Unger, who is an associate professor of law at Quinnipiac University School of Law. Wayne, appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
You're also listening to Maggie Mitchell-Salem, who's the executive director at the Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services in New Haven. Maggie, thank you so much for being on the show as well.
Thank you.
And of course, Tabita Sukdeo, who's the executive director of Connecticut Students for a Dream. Tabita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Jean Amatrita. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.